Hi all, it's Emily Rand. We're back with our 12-hour Valorant stream, and I am happy to be joined by game designer Trevor Romleski. He has done, 9 years in League of Legends before moving over to Valorant. Just first of all, thank you so much for joining me to just chat generally about agent design, champion design, and the Valorant metagame.
Yeah, happy to be on. Thanks for having me. And yeah, nine years at Riot and 6 and some change on Valorant itself. So
Oh wow, okay. So that was actually going to be my first question because I noticed when I looked into the champions that you kind of had a more of a hand in, it was like Aatrox, Rengar, Nami, the Twitch rework, if I remember correctly. And that was all like I keep thinking it was yesterday, but it was actually quite a long time ago. So when about did you start working on Valorant?
yeah, so little over 6 years was when I first joined the Valorant team. It was just a small group of a few of us starting out with just the idea. I was on League of Legends at the time on the champions team. Where I made Rengar, and I'll apologize to anyone who doesn't play Rengar for that. Uh, and yeah, up to the point where near the end of Aatrox's development, we started working on this idea um, that is now Valorant, and yeah, here we are today, all those years later.
For like one thing I wanted to go into before we start talking about the metagame that we have seen develop and then today's patch notes that just released, is I know you yourself have said in other interviews you've played a lot of different style of games. You designed champions for League of Legends, which is a MOBA. And I think designing agents is a lot different, right? Because I mean, one of the things that makes Valorant is agent abilities, but it also has a very similar tactics and gun economy and kind of not map design because I think people would take some issues with that, but like it generally has a lot more to do with CS and like a tactical shooter perspective. So when you started working on Valorant, what were your main goals in designing agents versus designing League of Legends champions?
Yeah, so one of the big things we took away from our time on League and experiences there is this concept of counterplay. That was a big deal in
Mm.
League of Legends, which is when you take an action as the person using an ability or a mechanic in the game, the opponent actually has options and decisions they get to make too. And that ultimately ends up being more fun for both sides rather than just you know uh, exposing someone to some mechanic or something, they have no response to it. Um, and this idea is an opportunity we saw in shooters at early on, and just general in the FPS space is what if we tried to make more abilities that didn't have to be limited to some of the core concepts you've seen up until that point of like grenades and whatnot, but also in injecting those into the experience. They're actually fun to play against. They're not things that just kind of you know res- immediately activate and you can't respond to and you have no agency in dealing with it. um, what if we could add a bunch of new life and inject new mechanics into the space, but it's actually hopefully fair and perceived as fair and more enjoyable to have those in the game rather than just guns and grenades.
When you're looking at agent abilities, because I think one of the fears when people initially saw the first, like all the way back in October, but then again, I believe in March, like right before the alpha camp was announced. There was a video released of the developers game testing it. And people are like, oh, this looks too much like Overwatch. It's going to be too ultimate dependent. You're going to have to do a lot of these things about like coordinating abilities. And the Valorant I've played is not like that. Like you still need to coordinate with your teammates, but it's not the same thing around ability usage. So, what did you want ability usage ultimately to be in Valorant?
Yeah, I mean, this was that's a great question, and it was a core point of debate and discussion and sometimes arguments for the team was what is that right ratio. Like one of the things we said is we wanted to make sure this game was an FPS first, and that shooting
Hmm.
mattered. It would always be relevant, and that abilities rarely, if ever, compromise on the shooting experience and your shooting skills. And that was a big focus for us. And over time, we tried to find what is that right balance? Is it 50-50 ability impact, weapon impact? Is it 40-60? Like what makes sense? And I would say over tons of uh, problem solving, collaboration, endless play tests. We play test 1 to 2 times a day for many years. We feel like we landed on something that felt like roughly the right balance where, your agent matters and your composition and what you pick. It has a role on your team that makes sense. Um, you can use all these abilities in a way to express yourself uniquely from other agents. But at the same time, guns still really matter. You still need to be able to shoot to be effective. And we believe we've landed on something that we think feels like the right balance. And obviously, over time, as we feel it out, as everyone in the community gives feedback and it helps us understand what's working and what's not, we'll really land on the balance that makes the most sense.
What would you say, since you gave percentages initially, like what would you say the percentage is right now, like agent ability usage to like gunplay?
I think interestingly enough, it can depend on the context of where you play. So like
Mm.
in the highest MMR scenario, we like to think that we found a really nice like 50-50 balance where, when you're really coordinating ultimate usage really well and your abilities and you're combining them with other agents and executing strategies that are super solid, abilities become very impactful, right? And you still have to use your guns in that world. They don't complete the whole loop. So we feel like it can be really 50-50. But as you change in different MMRs, it can be kind of different scenarios. Like maybe in a lower MMR situation where players aren't particularly as good as shooting, maybe abilities have more of an impact, and it could be like 60-40. And then maybe you get to a scenario where you're in a part of the matchmaker where like players are really good at shooting, but they haven't quite got the ability usage there. It can be different percentages, but I'd say our goal as you trend up to like the ideal scenario for the game is they feel like they have an equal contribution to one another, but they're both very important. And we're always, if we have to bias or err on one side, we'll choose guns because that's kind of the core of the experiences in FPS and shooting being impactful. So that's kind of our guidelines and rough targets for it.
So to piggyback on that, what is kind of what do you want gun economy to be? Because I think for people who are coming from League of Legends or from something that's not CS, gun economy is really, in my opinion, like super important in Valorant, but definitely not something that everyone kind of grasps right away. Like, how important did you want that to be with team play within the game?
Yeah, I mean, we wanted the economy to have a meaningful impact in every round. We wanted to add variability from round to round. We didn't want every round to be the same kind of thing. Like we wanted new tools to be interjected, whether it's the weapons or what abilities agents are bringing in, the current ultimate status, and all of those things are used to inform the kind of play or strategy you would utilize in that round with all the context of that. And what we wanted is an economy that sometimes puts you in scenarios where you'd be trying to scrape together a very low, a low price loadout and make something happen. And when you win in those scenarios, that's a high and it feels awesome. But we also want to make sure that on average you have a decent loadout where you feel like you have a lot of control of the situation. You get to use, the guns you want to use. You want the versatility of a rifle, more often than not as a baseline. So we try to balance injecting variability and different scenarios with the baseline that we know people really love utilizing and enjoying, which is like your typical, mostly full loadout with a rifle, and finding the right balance between all of those.
So when we look at the kind of, again, this is just in closed beta. We have a limited amount of tournaments to take a look at. I had a limited amount of VODs that I could find to try to gather data from. But when I looked at agent selection across a bunch of the like ladder tournaments in closed beta, Sage 100%, every single team. Cypher 100%, every single team. Breach 89%. Brimstone 69%, and then Raze was like the number one entry fragger that people picked. It was then between like having like a Raze or a Jet or a Phoenix, or having like Sova for double vision. What do you think of kind of the agent meta that's evolved, and what have you yourself seen throughout closed beta?
Yeah, so just a little bit of insight into how we perceive the situation, and I'm sure many of you have seen like the developer team will stream their five stack and play
Hmm.
games, and they participate in a couple tournaments, and that's actually really helpful for us too, because we get more insight, personally experiencing the game at that high level and seeing what other teams are doing in their strategies, and that concept of what the meta was brought up and discussed internally for us, and you can see in some of the patch notes that are coming out for the worldwide launch is attempting to address some of those things in addition to some of the changes you saw in the last patch. So we kind of defined it internally as like the clog meta, where Sage and Cypher are particularly good at stopping a lot of plays. They can hold down an area for an extremely long period of time, and that could become really oppressive on a map like Split, where you need mid,
Hmm.
and mid is often really inaccessible when you utilize those agents. Um, so our take is, obviously we want the range of agents to be diverse and them all to be picked to some extent at all levels of play. And we felt like that combination of these characters that slow down the round, stop pushes, was particularly powerful. And that's where you saw, in the last patch, some nerfs to Cypher, some nerfs to Sage as well. And then even in the patch you're seeing for launch, we've made further adjustments to that. And then in regard to Raze's potency as the entry relative to Jet and Phoenix, we've made some adjustments to try to add more team value to the duelist role, which is Jet
Hmm.
and Phoenix, to provide a little more variability in these really organized scenarios where players are fully utilizing the utility that characters bring, to give them a little more help in how they help the team, in addition to like them being the ideal case for moving in first and entering, just giving them a little more additional utility to help out.
So this is kind of a question that piggybacks off of that, and it's from chat. Is there a target amount of agents, or is it just as likely that there will be like 100+ agents at one time as the game continues, just like in League of Legends?
Yeah, so first and foremost, we recognize that injecting a new agent into the game is a lot more disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to understand what their abilities do. They're impacting every single map, and it changes all the plays and the strategies and how you react to various things with agents. And in a more tactical game, you have less. Um, when you're playing something like League of Legends, like the champion literally walks onto your screen, and you get to like watch them hit creeps and kind of like build a familiarity with the character. Whereas in Valorant, something can just fly over a wall and just hit you, and you kind of need to know what that is in the moment. So we definitely plan to take more time internally to test these things and adjust them and make sure they're in a healthy state before they enter the ecosystem of the maps and the other agents and the weapons. So we think overall the cadence will be slower than League, and that like critical mass where it starts to feel overwhelming is going to take a lot longer to get to. And our current philosophy is we want to cross that bridge when we get to it. We think we can release at a reasonable rate for the time being. And at the point in when it starts feeling overwhelming, or like it's too much information to deal with when entering the game, if you're new or just even if you're experienced, then we'll assess what we should do in that situation.
Something that my colleague Jacob Wolf, who has covered CS for a while, was talking about this morning is that he was kind of hoping that the game designers would have more of a focus on map releases than agent releases. What are you guys thinking of for map releases and keeping the kind of like map pool diversity kind of large?
Yeah, so our philosophy with maps is we want to try to, instead of throwing like 10 maps that we haven't tested very much and are not confident about all out at once, and then slowly like the community latches on to like one or two or maybe none, depending on the situation. We want to really intentionally release new maps that we feel like fill out the current map roster in the type of experience you get when you play it, and make sure that the gameplay is enjoyable. And when it's not, we want to be quick to respond and react to these things. So I think Split's a good example where we heard a bunch of feedback and we made some changes really quickly because we want the pool that exists to be really enjoyable. And for generally, whenever you get a map in the rotation, whatever you get, you're happy with. And over time, we'll assess like what's the right number of maps to be running at any given time. But we recognize when you consider all the agents that are available and trying to master or familiarize yourself with every level can get really complicated really quickly, especially at
Mhm.
higher levels of play where you want to learn how to use a certain ability in like 20 different scenarios on every single map. That's a lot of mind share. So we're trying to find the right balance of what's the total number of maps that feels good. There's enough variability there. Um, and it covers a wide range of experiences. Right? You know, we don't want all maps to feel similar or the same. We need to mix up the current rotation or the current pool and make sure it feels like the range is healthy.
From Blute Regnet, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. What are credentials for a cipher cam to be an exploit? For example, there's a Haven cam spot that lets you see a long from a tree. Would that technically be considered an exploit according to your credentials? And just generally, what are you looking at for actual exploits when you consider agent abilities?
Yeah, that's a good question because it's something we're still in real time figuring out. Like if I could be completely honest, like we didn't see a majority of these cameras when we played internally, you know, and maybe you know that's probably on us for not pushing the game to more limits and finding these things. But over time, we're experimenting with what what is creative and sandboxy and should be really encouraged versus what feels really oppressive or unfair to play against. So some obvious stuff for us is like if you place a cipher cam on a wall and it clips through the wall and you can see through the other side of a surface, but you can't see the camera from that side, that would be
Mm.
an exploit because that's really unfair and it's unreasonable for the opponent to even interact with that the camera. We're still figuring out exactly what placing cameras outside the gameplay space means. I think over time we're saying, hey, in general, putting things outside the gameplay space can be creative, but it can also make you have to consider, you know, hundreds of more spots that aren't particularly relevant to the gameplay space. So generally, we're trying to get rid of the really obvious stuff that's super exploitative and unfair, and we're still finding the right line for what do we encourage as creativity and rewarding those who find really fun sandboxy discoveries. And that's kind of a real time process for us right now.
And then I think one of the things that I know League of Legends has struggled with through the years, and I think has actually had a pretty good handle on it for the past few, some exceptions aside, is the age-old push-pull between competitive and casual. In a tactical shooter like this that still does have agent abilities, how are you guys approaching game design from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and I think it's important to express what our intent is in this space. You know, top line for us is that we want to make sure the experience is an enjoyable one at any skill range. So we want to make sure that you're having fun, or you know, hopefully you're having fun no matter what skill bracket you're in, and we always want to stay within those boundaries. When it comes to our prioritization or what we may focus on, our general approach is we want to make sure that at the highest levels of play for the players that are putting in the most hours, they're discovering, you know, all the crazy combinations and possibilities of the game, that it stays fun and enjoyable and fair in that environment. Because that's where the game's getting pushed to its limits. And we want to make sure it's an enjoyable place for those who are um, you know, putting the time and effort to get to that position. And then from there, we want to focus in on making sure from that point, when that's structurally solid, that all the MMRs beyond that skill rating are still enjoyable and fun and fair, and make sure that that's a good experience. We're not looking for some perfect balance where all agents are played at the same rate across all MMRs. I think that's really unreasonable. Characters with more team utility and kind of like more mentally valuable utility, like, oh, I assisted my teammate. That's something that's not as
Sage.
obvious and visceral. Yeah, maybe like a Sage. Those are generally going to be more appreciated in like tournaments or higher MMR scenarios. So we have to understand that that's going to happen to some extent. And the characters that are more flashy or more capable of carrying will probably be more valuable in these like scenarios where you just queue up with you and a couple friends or by yourself or something of that nature. But generally, that's our approach: is we want to start from the top, make sure that experience is enjoyable where it's being pushed the most, and then follow from there downwards and ensure that, hey, nothing is really out of whack where a specific agent is dominating the game and making it unfair or anything like that. And generally that gives us, when we look at it in that way, we can approach the problem from a different perspective. If we're saying, hey, this agent is particularly problematic in lower MMR, that impacts the kind of change we would make compared to if it was a problem in higher MMR, for example.
That makes sense. For another question from the chat, I don't know how much I'll be able to answer this actually, but I figured I'd ask. What are your thoughts on having a map selection like CS:GO? Is that more of like a once you guys have more maps, or is it something you haven't really focused on yet throughout the beta process?
Yeah, that's a question of kind of similar to the total agent pool
Mm-hmm.
that we're targeting. Is, when we get to a point where there's enough maps in the total pool, we have to start thinking about, well, how many actually exist in that pool? Do we want to allow you to express your preferences of what you'd prefer to get? I think we have this ideal hope that while watching the rotation, we can be pretty active about what's in the rotation and what's not. And if something's really unenjoyable or it's something someone would commonly want to downvote, that we can make it changes quickly or pull it out of the rotation and adjust it with something else. And to be honest, we're just not there yet until we don't think we're at that maximum number of maps in the pool where it's hitting maximum mind share. So we'll figure that out. But I think those are all tools we'll use to assess, is like whether there's preferences, whether we're confident that we can support it with live balance quick enough that it's not too painful. All things we're assessing.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, I think one of the things that you kind of deserve credit for is like Split used to be, I think, universally the most hated and uneven map. And you guys were pretty quick in giving it some quality of life changes, and even as recently as the patches today, I think from what it looks like anyway, obviously I haven't been able to go in and play it, but the opening up that midsection is actually pretty huge.
Yeah, big shout out to the maps team that was really quick to respond to that and assess where the map was at and what opportunities there were to improve the experience. Hopefully that's representative of or gives you a glance into the kind of approach we want to take with maps. Is, we don't want to leave a map that's unenjoyable or particularly imbalanced just stale in there for a long time. Like, we want to be able to react and make changes when appropriate. If we see that, maybe the right strategies haven't been discovered or there's still time to explore different agent compositions that help alleviate some struggles on the map, we want to leave room for that exploration. But ultimately, if there is a problem that feels unreasonable to solve, then we'll go ahead and take action.
So I'm gonna kind of use that as a segue, since I did talk about the split changes that just came through. The patch notes just released because the game is currently live in South Korea right now. I think the big thing I want to address regarding agent updates first, and it kind of piggybacks on some of the stuff we've already been talking about, are the changes to Sage. Because once again, she's getting, like, I don't want to say nerfs, but things are, cooldowns are being extended, or durations are being reduced, or for example, her barrier now has had its health reduced again. when we're talking about something like an agent like Sage, where there's no other, first of all, like I think it's important to note, there's no other healer to select, right, in Valorant right now. So it's not like she has like a lot of direct competition for her role. But then she is like pretty much 100% picked, especially in competitive, because the utility she brings to a team is really invaluable. You'd mentioned previously that you don't necessarily mind if certain agents are getting picked at really high rates across competition, but what is your philosophy on designing an agent like Sage who really doesn't have another, I guess, option to do what she does in game?
Yeah, that's another discussion we've had internally, and we've looked at the really high pick rates of Sage. And the question we ultimately are asking is Sage providing a value on the team that feels required and necessary that other agents currently aren't offering? And is that the source of her pick rate? Or as an agent and her current kit, it's just overpowered statistically and it makes her a must pick as a result. And that's kind of the question we ask that is between those 2 points. And we do believe to some extent that she is offering values that we don't offer with other agents in the game right now, one being healing. And that's something we recognize and is likely a consideration in her current pick rate. But also, we do think she's just very likely statistically overtuned, and that's what you're seeing as a result in this patch, where a lot of her numbers are coming down. So even in a world where there was other agents that compete with that value she brings, which is healing in this case, we still think she would likely be more valued to some meaningful degree, and that's why you're seeing some of these changes. But we're trying to thread the needle here, where we don't want to nerf her to the point where when other agents offer those values, she becomes not picked at all, or she's
Mm-hmm.
not appreciated. But for the time being, this is our best attempt at saying, hey, either way, these numbers should probably come down. She's having way too much impact for her role. And then we'll
You,
see over time as more agents come into the pool and can compete with the value she offers.
I was going to say, how much, like you kind of touched upon it, but just for clarity, like how much do you mind if she's still high picked due to utility? Like not being overtuned, but just due to utility alone.
Yeah, I mean, I think if that value is something that's really appreciated on a team and it's something that is felt like it's needed, that's going to help us understand what kind of agents we should be prioritizing and building in the future to help give more options and choices so that when you're building a composition, it still stays interesting and rich and how you mix and match these agents together. Um, what we do mind is if Sage is always an obvious must-have in my team composition at all points.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do we solve that by just nerfing her to a point where that's not the case, or make sure that there's healthy competition
Mm-hmm.
with the value that she offers? So I would say in general, we're not happy when an agent is a obvious must pick, no decision making going on in the draft. But our approach while we're still building out the core roster, obviously we have to be careful because we recognize some of these agents are offering a value that doesn't exist anywhere else yet.
Another question from chat. Do the devs agree with members of the community that duelists are just underpowered compared to other roles? I know you kind of touched upon this when talking about balancing them, right? But how do you feel entry fraggers or duelists are compared to other roles in Valorant right now?
Yeah. So as you can see in the notes, we did some updates to both Jet and Phoenix, and this wasn't us looking at these characters like in a vacuum of each of them in isolation. We were assessing the role of Duelist and the potency of Duelist as a whole, and that's what informed some of these changes. So uh, we agreed with the sentiment that uh, duelists relative to these other roles and their values weren't quite standing up to the efficacy of the competing roles. So we made some adjustments to raise their baseline utility to be more valuable for the team, but also at the same time staying sharp at being the best duelists at taking fights, making the most sense being the first agent in to take an engagement. So yeah, that we agree is the answer, and you're seeing some changes now to help increase the value and appreciation of that role when thinking about a composition.
Well, specifically with Jet, I feel like the tailwind change that it breaks Cypher's trap wires is actually pretty huge. Was that a part of kind of looking at what the role of a duelist is? Because obviously it makes her entry like really unhindered.
Yeah, it helps really emphasize and hammer in where she should really excel, which is being the first one in. If she can, dash through and break through some of these tools that would slow the whole team down, she can use timing to catch, opponents off by surprise. And also thematically, I think it's just cool and feels really powerful that her dash can burst out of these things that would hold back most other agents. And we think to your point, it helps further emphasize and sharpen what Jet should be good at. And we want to make sure that that's really clear and obvious that, hey, a duelist who's supposed to break out and take fights and be in first shouldn't be as hindered by a lot of these tools that slow down most other agents and stop pushes or, attempts to swing on an angle and take a duel.
Blocking sight.
This is kind of again, I don't know how much you'll be able to answer this, so I figure I'll ask. It's a chat question. Are you considering adding another support?
Blocking sight.
Got hit really hard. Would that help balance things a bit? You kind of already touched upon this when talking about Sage as an agent, but how much are you considering adding another healing support to the, or I don't even know if support is the right word, but like another healer basically to the agent pool?
Yeah, we have a bunch of ideas for additional types of agents that we think would be great to add into the pool. Supports is certainly or like characters in the Sage realm of value. We want to make sure
Sentinel,
that
right? Or is she
yeah,
called a Sentinel?
she,
Yeah. I forget what
she's
the label is.
Yeah, her role is Sentinel, but she definitely in the range of Sentinel, she's on the much more supportive side where she's able to provide healing and help. She can boost her team. So we definitely want more agents that also provide that type of value in their own unique way. In addition to a lot of other alternatives or other ways to look at those roles in the future. So.
And then turning back to these patch notes, what is, because like I remember when initial changes for Phoenix came through, people were like, why? Phoenix is perfect. Like ideally, what kind of agent do you want Phoenix to be?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we want Phoenix to fit within the role we've defined, which is duelist. So, our expectation is Phoenix should be going in and entry fragging, taking the first fights. And then thematically, we want Phoenix to feel a little bit selfish. He's pretty reliant. He has a lot of versatility that's focused on himself, right? So if you think about his, the flash he throws or his flame wall, all these things are less valuable from a team perspective, especially when comparing them to utility of someone like Breach's ability to flash. But Phoenix can go in and do things himself, right? And even the idea of like the fire doing friendly fire damage is like, hey, everyone stay back. Let me just go in and make a move, make a play. I can self isolate. I can debuff my opponents and get an advantageous fight. And the ult's like a really obvious in your face example of Phoenix doing that thing. So that's what we see Phoenix as is generally a more selfish duelist character who has lighter touches of versatility through a lot of his abilities that are most effective for himself to capitalize on as opposed to support for his team to capitalize on.
And then I kind of want to ask the question, I'm not sure if I think of Omen as a duelist, but like where I feel like when people talk about Omen, right, they just think of his, like whenever people talk about his abilities for a team, they always talk about the smokes, and they're like, well, why would you pick Omen when you can just pick Brimstone, who offers way more utility, has like an insane ultimate for zone controlling or controlling like an entire like spike plant point. Where do you want Omen to fit? Like what is his ideal role on a team, and what can he contribute that just doesn't make him like people comparing him basically to Brimstone because of the smokes?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Omen, you know, definitely is fitting in the same role as Brimstone and Viper in the same space, right? Is they're providing vision blocking or vision denial for the team to reduce the amount of angles that you enter into a space, because generally that can be really overwhelming. And this helps limit the amount of the angles you have to deal with. We kind of think of it as like air coverage, so to speak, where that's literal with Brimstone, but that, that's what a lot of the characters or the agents are providing there. Omen is one that we think can do it from a different perspective. So, you know, Omen's able to throw these smokes across the map and you don't really know where they come from. So he can be particularly exceptional at going off by himself and making a play while still supporting the team at the same time, and ultimately meet back with the team via the ultimate. And that's kind of the general idea of where we want Omen. That being said, we made a lot of changes to Omen in the launch, and we feel like we're really getting the character to the place we want it to be as an agent in the roster, with the changes most recently. But our hope is what Omen can offer is Omen doesn't need to be directly with the team in the sense like Brimstone, who is limited by range of where he can drop his smokes, and he generally is wanting to utilize like the stim beacon to be near the allies and enhance them in that moment. Omen creates the optionality to be in a different place than what your team's doing, or even just provide some ambiguity by placing a smoke in an area and maybe Omen's there, maybe Omen is not, right? That's the thing that's harder for someone like Brimstone to do, where you just drop the smoke and you don't have a lot of them and they're limited by range. So your intent is a lot more clear with Brim, but it's also like more explosive because you can drop 3 at once and make a play really quickly.
I'm not sure how much, again, you can elaborate on this, but I think one of the most important things with Valorant is our audio cues. And that was kind of one of the things that was also touched upon on this patch is it says you guys brought in more sounds made by agents under the category of sounds to display audio distance. What are you like in a tactical shooter, like footsteps and just audio in general is like super, super important. What exactly are these changes that came to like sound visualization?
Yeah, so one thing we had in the closed beta that was kind of hard to see, and some people saw it, realized it, and some people didn't. But you actually get a visualization of the radius of your footsteps when you're running and
Mm-hmm.
making noise. And the reason we want to do that is because it's very hard to understand like how much sound am I actually making just from the audio, right? Like I couldn't tell you, and I've helped with some of the numbers, to define how far that is. Um, in the moment, I couldn't tell you if an exact place I'm standing makes noise to a spot where I think the opponent might be. And because of
Mm-hmm.
that, and the only real reasonable way to test that is like jump into a custom game, find a friend to go to that other spot and tell you if it's just very unreasonable. So we visualize the footsteps to help you understand like, hey, here's where you probably should start walking, because if an enemy's in the spot, they can hear you. We are looking to do that with more things across the game than just footsteps. So if I want to understand how loud um, reloading a weapon is, and where enemies can hear reloading, that's going to be more visualized and can help you understand the distance of that. Or um, firing off, like if I'm Omen and I teleport, who can hear that? How far can they hear it from? Does it
Mm-hmm.
make noise or does it not? That's all really difficult to understand without any visualization. So we're hoping these additions to the minimap can help make that more clear, and then you can more intentionally play around the sound cues and understand when you have the potential of being heard versus not.
And then we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you a really general question that you're
Okay.
probably going to dislike. But ideally, like since game design and balance design is so finicky, what is your like ideal picture of what Valorant is as a tactical shooter? Like what are your like ultimate goals with Valorant?
Yeah. So, and I'm assuming you mean mostly from like a gameplay
Yeah,
perspective of,
yeah.
yeah, okay. Um, Ultimately for us with Valorant is we want the core tenets of a shooter and more importantly a tactical shooter to be important, right? We want aiming to matter. We want controlling your weapon and managing stability to matter. We want all the core mechanics of a shooter to be relevant and part of the game and respected. But we also want to inject some new uh, experiences and scenarios that you may not be used to and will require creative problem solving or uh, decision making round to round that you have to deal with. So now something you might be used to navigating with just a gun and particular shapes in the level, you have an agent that can teleport across the map in the round, and like how do you play the round differently and assess that creates new requirements to be adaptive and adjust and find new creative ways to solve the tactical puzzle every single round. And our hope is that stays really interesting as you're constantly interacting with new agent combinations in every match on different levels, to create what we ultimately want is lots of depth and replayability. We want you to be able to put tons of hours into this game and get the satisfaction and the reward for that when you play and realize that and appreciate it. And we hope that this combination of core fundamentals of tactical gameplay paired with agents that are providing abilities that do some wild stuff that hopefully people haven't really seen in these tactical scenarios creates a really enjoyable fun experience that has a lot of replayability.
And on that note, I'm going to finish with one last question from chat. If you can give players advice for playing this game like tactically correctly, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think one of the tricky things about tactical games and kind of going into the definition of tactical is a lot of your actions that lead up to the moment of combat sometimes or even more often than not are more important than the actions you take during combat. So if you're not thinking about your approach and you just kind of react to seeing an opponent, you're already at a huge disadvantage and it's pretty hard to tell that's the case up front. You have to think about this is why crosshair placement is important. It's important to think about recoil and making your first few shots count as well as you can, using your agent's abilities to set you up for an advantageous situation where you either surprise your opponent or they weren't properly prepared or aimed on the position. How do you use the literal definition of tactics to gain an advantage in the scenarios where action actually happens? Because if you're just looking to react and respond and outplay someone in the moment, you're not taking into account really critical aspects of being successful in the game.
All right. Well, Trevor, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that we can like get even more into the weeds with Valorant metagame once we see a lot of these tournaments going out. Best of luck with
Thank you.
designing and to your balance team because they have their work cut out for them. But I think this is a really great game, and I really love what you guys have done with it, especially with making sure that again, gunplay and agent abilities are kind of almost at an equal level with each other.
Yeah,
Um,
thank
oh
you.
no, go for
Oh,
it.
thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, Emily, and it's an exciting time. We're seeing some launches start to happen. Really excited to see everyone getting in and trying the game who didn't get into the closed beta, and those of you in the closed beta jumping in and getting to play and experience it again. We're just really excited to hear the feedback and thoughts and continue every day to strive to make the game better and better.